people in recent years have been turning to crowdfunding for answers to private problems that are just too big to solve. People go public appealing for help on things as, logical as launching new ideas and products to, pretty much anything. Nothing's too crazy, it seems, for sites like GoFundMe or Kickstarter. But increasingly, people are also turning to these kind of sites to raise funds for medical treatments, to pay for specialists' bills and all the other associated costs that come with having a serious illness. This is particularly happening in the US because, as we know, they have no real medical safety net like ours. So why is it also beginning to happen here? Ariel Bogle is a technology reporter for the ABC and she's looked into medical crowdfunding in Australia. Good morning, Ariel.
Good morning.
Also with us is Richard Vines. He's co-founder of Rare Cancers Australia, and we'll get his opinion in a minute. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning, Cassie.
Now, let me see, I've put you on the wrong microphone there. Now, Ariel, $145 million has been raised in Australia through some of these sites for personal reasons. Does that surprise you? Is that a lot, do you think?
Well, that's the figure that GoFundMe, one of these American crowdfunding sites, has raised here for personal causes. And that's not just medical causes. But what really piqued my interest is that in recent years, as you mentioned, I've been seeing a lot of coverage of the rise of crowdfunding in America to cover, to save people's lives, basically, when they fall through the cracks because of the lack of healthcare there, the lack of the safety net. But I was curious why it was happening here too. Australia has universal healthcare. It's specifically designed so that people don't go into bankruptcy because of ill health, that we can get access to the medications we need no matter the cost. So why are people crowdfunding? And that was the question I asked. And it was really interesting to me to find out some of the personal stories there. Some people are trying to fund trips overseas so they can access experimental treatments. And if a treatment is experimental, that may be very much why it's not accessible to Australians. But other people are just trying to access basic medical care. It's really hard to cost the impact of stage 4 cancer diagnosis. That means you may not be able to work any longer. You may need access to special medicines. You may need access to oxygen. These are all very costly things that you will need to have a good quality of life and to survive potentially.
So that's why people are turning to these sites. It does raise the question, though, of a very ugly kind of popularity contest. And I guess some of the more sympathetic stories can be the ones about children or men who are breadwinners who are trying to support their family. What have you found out about that?
That's exactly right. I actually spoke to an academic who studied crowdfunding in America, Nora Kenworthy. She's at the University of Washington. And she looked into this as some of the narratives. And I mean, whether we like to admit it or not, there are popular narratives around who deserves medical care, a sort of competition of deservingness or a popularity contest, if you like. Children, I mean, that's just a narrative that we're always going to be open to, a sick child. It makes total sense. But on the other hand, she found that people with multiple issues, whose issues might stem not just from illness but from poverty or disadvantage, they found it very hard to tell their story in an engaging way on these sites and were disadvantaged compared to someone with a nice, clean, neat narrative.
Yes.
One child, one illness, this money will save their life.
What could a child have done to have brought this on themselves? So that's the kind of idea. So maybe smoking-related illnesses
lung
are
cancer.
A perfect example of this. Yeah. Richard Vines, raising money for people with rare cancers. Tell us the logic of that. Actually, once you think it through, it's quite clear why you need to do that. But explain it to us.
Yeah, look, it's...
Sorry, just wait a sec. I'll just make sure I give you a microphone. There you go.
There we go.
Yeah.
That's better. Look, it's the way our system works. The PBS is designed essentially to do the greatest good for the greatest number. And it doesn't work well for rare cancers. And because to get a drug reimbursed and available on the PBS, you need to produce evidence of large-scale effectiveness. And if you've only got 50 patients in the country who are diagnosed with a particular cancer, you just can't produce that evidence. And the only way then that you can access the medicine is by paying for it. So you end up with a situation where rich people can access life-saving or life-extending treatments and poor people can't. And crowdfunding is their only solution. And what Ariel says is right. Sometimes it works brilliantly. Sometimes it doesn't work so well. And we have a kind of hybrid or slightly modified version of it where in the circumstance that we had a little boy who was 12 years old, blonde-haired, blue-eyed. He was on commercial television. He raised $270,000 pretty much in 2 days. And he only needed $100,000 for his treatment. So his family and us, we used that for another 7 patients. We used the surplus for another 7 patients.
Is that right?
And that was just an extraordinary gift to those people. But it's a problem that's addressable. It's just not being addressed at the moment. And crowdfunding is kind of the only immediate solution. Yeah,
it's the last-ditch effort, I suppose, for people who find themselves in the most terrible of circumstances. What would you like to see in an ideal world?
In an ideal world, there'll always be a delay between a drug becoming available in the US and getting here. So we'll always need a little bit of this kind of system. But essentially, at the moment, we have 240 different cancer types on our website. And technically, to get a drug like these latest immuno-oncology drugs that we're hearing all the time, the ones that Ron Walker from Formula One used and all that, they potentially apply to 30, 40, 50 cancers. Each one of those at the PBS, each one of those requires a separate application, separate data, separate research to get the drug reimbursed. And not surprisingly, companies start with the most common ones and work their way down to the rarest. So we need a system where we can combine those kinds of applications and get the drug out to people who need it quickly. Yeah,
it's a dilemma, isn't it? Because no one wants to see medicines that aren't tested to Australian standards being made available to Australian patients. I guess that's part of the problem.
It is part of the problem, but it's not an unresolvable part of the problem. We're not talking about the TGA is responsible for safety and effectiveness, and we're not talking about bypassing the current processes inside the TGA.
That's the Therapeutic Goods Administration.
Yeah, and they're responsible for safety and efficacy, and the PBS is largely responsible for cost effectiveness.
So you're looking at, say, very highly supervised use of these drugs.
Exactly.
Right.
That's the perfect solution.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it's a real dilemma, isn't it? Because if you can raise, what would you say, $270,000 in 2 days, I mean, problem solved. There is I can see why it's so attractive to lots of people in this situation. But really, it's not a long-term sort of structural approach.
No, it's not. You get rapidly, widely varying results. We had a chap a few years ago who was 74 who was responding extremely well to these kinds of medicines because we were supporting him out of our central fund, but he was unable to raise any money at all. And in the end, he died because he couldn't access the medicines. And that's just a tragedy that if he had a salivary gland cancer, if he'd had a melanoma, he would still be chugging along today because it's listed on the PBS for melanoma.
Yeah, that's just one case that you know of, one that's come to. Who knows what other cases there would be happening around the country. Yeah, and I guess that's another charge that's sort of raised every now and again about the incredibly high-profile breast cancer campaign. The Pink Ribbons has been so successful, and maybe potentially at the cost of other treatments.
Yeah, look, I think that we treat them as the gold standard to which we aspire. They've taken patient voice and patient advocacy to a level that is just brilliant, and as a consequence, the survival rates of breast cancer patients have gone from, I think, 65% in 1990 to today it's well over 90%, and that's directly relatable to the effectiveness.
Yeah. Ariel Bogle, I mean, the maker of one of these platforms, I think Richard Solomon, who you would...
Rob Solomon, yeah.
Rob Solomon. Yeah, he described it as a storytelling platform.
That's right.
That's an interesting way of describing it.
Yeah, so I interviewed Rob Solomon. He's the founder and CEO of GoFundMe, which is probably the biggest online crowdfunding campaign website in the world. And he was saying to me that even he was surprised that medical crowdfunding was the most popular category for crowdfunding on his site in Australia, just like in America and other countries. But he was talking about it, yes, as a storytelling platform. If you go on GoFundMe, it talks you through how to write a catchy headline, how to share photos and videos to promote your campaign. And that actually points to another interesting issue, privacy, I suppose. If you're crowdfunding, say, for your child, what wouldn't you do to raise money for your own child, of course, but at the same time, you're creating a permanent record about that child's life on the internet, which, as we know, is hard to get rid of. Posting intimate photos, photos of them in the hospital beds, details about the sort of person. And, it's a balancing act for these parents, and one that is a completely unenviable choice. You may think that you're also raising awareness about illness, which is a very good thing. But these are the types of choices public crowdfunding make people go through.
It's a fascinating trend, isn't it? Because you can see that the effectiveness of it does spur it on. But, Richard, you're saying give the money to maybe not necessarily yours, but to some kind of foundation that can actually smooth the way for more people.
Yeah, and can actually make sure that the money goes to where it's supposed to go, and it's properly administered, and people who are very vulnerable are not exploited.
Yeah, good message. Thank you both for just teasing out this dilemma for us. It's a fascinating one. Richard Vines is with the Rare Cancers Australia. You can find that online. And Ariel Bogle is a ABC technology reporter. Coming up, Richard Feindler and Conversations. He's got Mandy Lindcatron on, fascinating woman from US.